The entire bar went silent when the Marine grabbed her arm and said, "You need to leave, now." She didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, just looked at him with eyes that had seen things he couldn't imagine. Operating tables in active combat zones, wounded men bleeding out in the dark, decisions made in seconds that determined who lived and who didn't. Sergeant Roland Mercer had no idea the woman he just put his hands on had once outranked every person in that room. Not just outranked, she had commanded them, all of them, every ship, every sailor, every order that kept the entire naval fleet moving. He called her weak, he called her lost. He laughed. And then the night fell apart in a way none of them were ready for. If this story already has you gripped, follow me right now. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. The Kestrel and Anchor had been a military bar for going on 32 years. It wasn't the kind of place that advertised itself. No neon signs, no happy hour specials on a chalkboard out front. The building sat 3 blocks from the Halcyon Bay Naval Station in Port Calder, North Carolina, on a street where the sidewalks were cracked and the streetlights buzzed with that particular yellow hum that felt like the 1980s never left. Regular people drove past it without a second look. That was the point. The Kestrel and Anchor was for military, and the military liked to be left alone. Inside, the walls were covered in the way only decades of accumulation could manage. Shadow boxes with medals, unit patches pinned in clusters, photographs of men and women in desert camo and flight suits and dress whites, their faces caught in that specific kind of pride that comes from surviving something. A long oak bar ran the length of the left wall, its surface worn smooth by 10,000 elbows. The stools were mismatched, the lighting was low. The music, when it was playing, was always turned down just enough that you had to lean in to hear the person across from you. On a Thursday night in late October, the place was packed. A Marine unit was rotating out in 2 days, 3rd Battalion, stationed temporarily at Halcyon Bay for joint training exercises, and the energy in the room carried that particular edge of men who knew they were about to be sent somewhere and were trying not to think about it too hard. Laughter was louder than usual. The pitchers were getting refilled faster. Someone near the pool table was telling a story that kept getting interrupted by groans and then bigger laughter. Clara Voss sat alone at the far end of the bar. She was in her early 50s, though she could have passed for younger if the lighting was kinder. Brown hair pulled back simply, no product, the kind of practical style that said she hadn't thought about it for more than 30 seconds. She was wearing dark slacks and a navy blue pullover, nothing that announced anything. Her hands were wrapped around a glass of club soda with lime. She wasn't drinking alcohol. She wasn't talking to anyone. She was just sitting there, watching the room. Not in the way people watch a room when they're bored or when they're waiting for someone who's late. The way she watched was different, methodical. Her eyes moved in patterns. Exits first, then the bar staff, then the clusters of people, cataloging without appearing to catalog. It was the kind of observation that took years to build into habit, until it stopped being something you did consciously and became something you simply were. The bartender, a big-shouldered man named Pete, who'd done 2 tours as a Navy corpsman before his knee gave out, had noticed it. He'd set down her club soda without asking questions. Something about her made him feel like asking questions would be wrong, somehow. He'd been around enough people to know when someone was carrying something that wasn't his business. She'd arrived 40 minutes ago, taken the same stool, ordered the same drink, and hadn't moved. The unit sergeant was the one who noticed her first in the wrong way. Sergeant Roland Mercer was 29 years old and built like a doorframe. Wide shoulders, thick neck, the kind of physical presence that had probably gotten him through more situations by intimidation alone than he'd ever had to put actual skill toward. He'd been in the Corps for 8 years and had the confidence of someone who'd never been truly tested in a way that revealed his limits. He was good at what he did, good enough that he'd stopped questioning whether there were things he didn't know. He was 3 beers in when he spotted Clara at the end of the bar. His corporal, a younger man named Dex, with close-cropped hair and an easy grin, leaned over and said something low. Mercer shook his head. "Who is she? She a base wife?" Dex shrugged. "Doesn't look like it. She's just sitting there." "This place isn't for civilians." Mercer set his beer down. "Somebody should tell her." The corporal's grin tightened. "Sergeant, I don't think that's—" But Mercer was already moving. He crossed the bar in the way he crossed most spaces, like he expected them to make room for him. A couple of guys from his unit watched him go. One of them elbowed another. The energy at the pool table dropped a notch. Pete, the bartender, wiping down the far end of the counter, looked up and felt something tighten in his chest. Mercer stopped beside Clara and didn't sit down. "Hey!" His voice was the volume he used when he was trying to be civil, but wanted to make it clear there was a version of this conversation that wouldn't be civil. "This is a military establishment. You're going to have to find somewhere else." Clara looked up from her glass. She took him in, all of him, in about 2 seconds, and then said, "I'm fine here, thanks." Her voice was even, not nervous, not apologetic, not the voice of someone who'd been caught somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. Mercer blinked. "I'm not asking." "I heard you." She turned back to her drink. The move was so calm that it took him a moment to process it. He wasn't used to being dismissed. Not like that. Not by someone who looked like she was waiting for a book club meeting. "Lady." He shifted his weight, and his voice came down a register into something with more weight behind it. "I don't know if you wandered in here by mistake, but this isn't a place for what?" She looked at him again, and there was something in her eyes that made the next word stick briefly in his throat before he pushed through it. "For civilians." "All right." She said it the way you'd say all right to someone who'd just read you a weather report that didn't change your plans. Calm, mildly interested, not moving, Mercer's jaw set. Behind him, he was aware that his guys were watching. Half the bar was watching. The way things were going, this was going to look bad for him if he walked away, and something in him, something that hadn't learned when to let a thing go, couldn't quite do it. He put his hand on her arm. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." What happened next was so quick and so controlled that most people in the bar would have trouble describing it afterward. Clara didn't yell, didn't jerk back. Her free hand came up. Her fingers found his wrist. Not grabbing, just placing. And she applied pressure to a very specific point on the inside of his wrist that made his grip go loose before his brain had time to tell his hand to keep holding. She wasn't rough about it. She was precise. It was the difference between a surgeon making an incision and someone hacking with a kitchen knife. Mercer's hand dropped. He stared at it for a second like it had done something without his permission. Clara set her glass down on the bar, slowly, and then she turned to face him fully for the first time. "Don't do that again," she said. She wasn't angry. She wasn't performing calm, the way people do when they're furious and trying to look in control. She was actually calm. And somehow that was worse. Mercer's unit was completely quiet now. A few of the older guys at the bar had gone still in a different way than the younger ones, with the careful attention of men who recognized something they'd seen before and were waiting to understand what they were looking at. Pete, the bartender, had stopped pretending to wipe the counter. Mercer straightened up. His face had gone the particular shade of red that happened when his body started deciding whether the response to embarrassment was retreat or escalation. His instinct, 8 years of it, chose escalation. "You just put your hands on a Marine sergeant," he said. "You put yours on me first. That's not—" He stopped. Restarted. "What is your name? Are you on base? Do you have any idea, "I have a very clear idea," she said, "of where I am and why I'm here." She picked up her glass of club soda and took a sip. "I suggest you go back to your table." The laughter that came from somewhere in the room wasn't loud, but it was sharp, and it landed on Mercer like a slap. He turned. A couple of younger Marines were looking away too fast. One of them had his hand over his mouth. That was the thing that broke it open. "You think this is funny?" His voice went up, filled the room. The music was still playing, but nobody was listening to it anymore. "She doesn't belong in here. None of you are going to say something? This is a military bar. This is our space. She can go find a— Roland." The voice came from the corner booth, and it was quiet enough that it shouldn't have cut through the noise, but it did. A man in his mid-60s, sitting alone with a glass of bourbon and the stillness of someone who hadn't moved in a while and didn't intend to. Retired, clearly. He was in civilian clothes, but his posture told you everything. The kind of posture that didn't go away when the uniform came off. He was watching Mercer with eyes that weren't unkind, just honest. "Enough," the old man said. Mercer knew him. Everyone in the unit knew former Master Gunnery Sergeant Aldous Briggs, who had 31 years of service behind him and had seen things that most active-duty Marines only read about. He didn't come into the Kestrel and Anchor often, but when he did, people listened to him. Mercer's jaw worked. He looked at Clara, then at Briggs, then back at Clara. "She shouldn't be in here," he said again, but it had lost something. "Sit down," Briggs said. The sergeant held his ground for another 3 seconds, the exact amount of time it took for him to realize holding it any longer would cost him more than giving it up. And then he turned and walked back toward the pool table. The men around it found very interesting things to look at on the floor. Clara watched him go. Then she turned back to the bar, repositioned her glass exactly where it had been, and that was that. Briggs looked at her from the corner booth. He'd been watching her since she came in, and there was something about the way she held herself. Not tense, not relaxed in the way people get when they don't pay attention, but that particular quality of alertness that lived in trained people, that had made him set his bourbon down and just observe. He'd spent 31 years learning to read people. It was how he'd survived long enough to retire. He couldn't place her, but he knew what he was looking at wasn't what it looked like. The next 20 minutes went almost back to normal. Mercer and his guys regrouped at the pool table, volume coming back up. The incident already getting folded into a story that would change in the retelling until it was something other than what it was. The bar noise rebuilt itself around the gap. Clara finished her club soda and was in the process of deciding whether she wanted another when everything went wrong. It wasn't loud at first. That was the thing about medical emergencies in public spaces. They rarely announced themselves the way people imagined. There was no dramatic crash, no cinematic collapse, just a sound. A wet, choked sound, the sound of an airway doing something it shouldn't, and then a chair scraping hard against the floor, and then someone saying, "Whoa, whoa, Eddie." The man's name was Eddie Carmichael, though Clara didn't know that yet. He was 67, a retired Navy commander who came to the Kestrel and Anchor every Thursday without fail, always ordered a scotch and a club sandwich, always sat at the second table from the back. He was having a heart event, a serious one, and his body was announcing it the way bodies do when the announcement is already late. He had pitched sideways out of his chair. One of the men he'd been sitting with had caught him, which was the only reason he wasn't on the floor. His color was wrong. The grayish blue at the lips that meant something systemic was failing, not just one thing, but the chain reaction of one thing triggering another. His breathing was labored and getting worse. The bar erupted. Marines trained for direct action, for combat scenarios, for the choreography of tactical response. And what that training sometimes failed to account for was what happened when the threat was invisible, and the victim was someone you knew, and the tools at your disposal were limited to your 2 hands and whatever was on a bar table. The unit was on its feet. Someone was already on a phone. 2 guys near Eddie were crouched beside him, talking fast, but the talking was covering the fact that neither of them knew what to do. One of them was pressing on his chest without any clear sense of whether that was the right call. Clara was already moving. She didn't run. Running created panic, and panic made the crowd close in on itself instead of opening up. She moved fast but smoothly, cutting through the room toward the second table, and when she arrived, she said, with the exact volume needed to be heard without spiking anyone's adrenaline further, "Move back! Give him air!" The authority in her voice was the kind that didn't need volume to work. It just needed to be real, and it was. People moved. The man pressing on Eddie's chest rocked back on his heels without quite knowing why he'd listened. Clara knelt beside Eddie Carmichael, and her hands went to work. She checked his airway first, tilting his head back with 2 fingers under his jaw, the way you do it when you're not trying to look like you know what you're doing, but because you actually need to know. Then pulse, carotid, 3 seconds. She looked at his color, at the rhythm of his breathing, at the slight tremor in his left hand that told her something about the nature of what was happening. "Who's called 911?" she said. "Already on it," someone said from behind her. "Good. Tell them 67-year-old male, suspected cardiac event, altered consciousness, possible arrhythmia. Tell them we need AED guidance on the phone right now." A pause. "She's on hold." "Get off hold." Clara didn't look up. "Tell them you have a medical professional on scene and you need them on the line, not on hold." She heard someone relaying that. She was already repositioning Eddie, bringing him to the angle she needed, her hands going to his sternum, feeling for the landmarks she needed. She pulled back his collar. She looked at his fingertips. "Does anyone know if he's on blood thinners?" she said. "Any medications? Heart history?" The man who'd been sitting with Eddie, 50s, retired Navy by the look of him, face pale and tight, said, "He had a stent put in 2 years ago. I don't know what medications." That's helpful. She meant it. What's his name? Eddie. Okay. She looked at Eddie Carmichael's face. Eddie? Stay with me. Help's coming. He couldn't respond, but she talked to him anyway. That part wasn't medical training. That was something older. She began compressions. Correct rate, correct depth. The numbers running in the back of her head without her having to think about them. 30 years of experience making the technique automatic so her actual attention could stay on him, on the small data points his body was giving her, on whether what she was seeing was changing and in which direction. The bar had gone completely silent. Mercer stood near the pool table. He was watching her. Every one of his guys was watching her. The laughter from 15 minutes ago was so far away it might as well have been in another country. Pete the bartender had appeared beside Clara with the bar's first aid kit. Not because she'd asked, but because something in the way she was working told him she might need it. She glanced up, took it, and found the aspirin without hesitating. He's conscious enough to swallow, she said, half to herself, and then made the judgment call and got one aspirin into him, checking his airway again after. The 911 operator came on the line, and Clara handled the call while continuing compressions, her voice staying level, giving the operator exactly what they needed in the order they needed it. No wasted words, no emotion in the clinical part. And then she handed the phone back and kept working. Briggs from the corner watched all of this. He'd seen a lot of things in his career. He'd seen trauma surgeons in field hospitals work under conditions that made the Kestrel and Anchor look like a sterile operating suite. He'd seen medics do things with less equipment than Clara had on that bar floor. And the way she moved, the sequencing, the voice control, the exact pressure of each compression, the way she noticed Eddie's left hand tremor and adjusted her assessment. That wasn't nursing school. That wasn't even a good ER. That was something else. That was training that happened in places where you didn't have time to go slow, and the cost of mistakes was measured in lives. He kept watching her and he didn't say anything. Paramedics arrived 9 minutes after the call. That was faster than usual for Port Calder. Someone had pushed it. The two-person crew came in with the controlled urgency of professionals, and Clara stepped back at exactly the right moment, giving them room, briefing the lead paramedic in under 60 seconds. Everything they needed, nothing they didn't. The paramedic, a woman in her 30s, listened to Clara's handoff and then did something that several people in the bar later mentioned. She looked up from Eddie Carmichael and gave Clara a small nod. Professional to professional. One set of trained hands acknowledging another. Then they had Eddie on the gurney, and they were moving. Clara stood up. She was slightly out of breath. Compressions were physical work, real work, and she had a smear of something on her sleeve that she didn't look at. She rolled the cuff up. She looked around the room once, making sure there was nothing else that needed her, and then she walked back to the bar. She sat back down on her stool. She looked at her glass, which was empty now, and she asked Pete for a water. The room was still quiet. The kind of quiet that happens after something large moves through a space and the air hasn't settled back into place yet. Mercer was still standing by the pool table. He hadn't moved in a long time. He was looking at the stool where Clara had been sitting before, and then at the place by the second table where she'd worked for 9 minutes on a man's life, and then at the back of her head as she sat at the bar. He didn't say anything. Not yet. Dex appeared beside him and said something under his breath, and Mercer didn't answer. Briggs had come up from his corner booth at some point during the paramedic handoff and was now standing closer to the bar. Not right next to Clara, but close enough. He had his bourbon glass in one hand and he was watching the middle distance with the expression of someone doing arithmetic. Pete set down the water. Clara picked it up and drank half of it. The music, which no one had thought to change, was still playing at the same low volume, but it felt wrong now, the way ambient sound feels wrong after a scene has shifted underneath it. And then the door opened. Not the paramedics. They'd left. Not a late customer. The door opened and 2 men in uniform came in, and the energy of the room changed again in a different way. Because these were officers, and they carried the specific gravity of officers who were not here socially. They were Navy. The insignia on their shoulders said so clearly. And they looked around the room until they found what they were looking for. One of them, a commander by rank, came directly to Clara. He stopped beside her stool. He said quietly, "We need to speak with you, ma'am." Clara looked at him. "All right." "Not here." She considered this for a moment. Then she put her water glass down, got her jacket from the hook under the bar. She'd hung it there when she came in, quietly, the way she did everything, and stood up. She followed the two officers toward the door. Mercer watched her go. Briggs watched her go. Nobody in the bar said a word. At the door, she paused. Just for a second. She turned back and looked at the space where Eddie Carmichael had collapsed, and there was something in her face that had nothing to do with professional composure. Something quick and human, the kind of look people give a place where something serious happened when they think no one is watching. And then she was gone. The door swung shut behind her. Briggs set his bourbon on the bar. He looked at Pete. "Who is she?" Pete asked. Briggs was quiet for a moment, then, "I don't know yet." He said it like it was a problem he intended to solve. Outside, under the yellow buzz of the streetlights, the two officers had stopped on the sidewalk. One of them was on a phone. Clara stood with her arms loose at her sides, listening. Whatever they were telling her, her expression didn't change. A black SUV with government plates had parked at the curb. Engine running. Tinted windows. A driver who didn't get out. Clara looked at the SUV and then looked at the officer on the phone, and she said something to him. 2 words, maybe 3. And the officer nodded quickly. Quickly in the way people nod when the person speaking to them has a higher ceiling of authority than they want to think about. She got in. The SUV pulled away from the curb. Inside the Kestrel and Anchor, Mercer had finally moved. He was standing at the bar now, not quite where she'd been sitting, but close, looking at the stool. His beer was in his hand, but he wasn't drinking it. One of the older men at the bar, retired Navy, 50s, salt and pepper beard, had watched the whole thing and had come to stand nearby. He looked at Mercer. "You know what you just did?" the man said. Mercer looked at him. "That's not a question I can answer yet," the man said, "but I'd start thinking about it." He walked away. Mercer stood at the bar for a long time after that, and no one bothered him, and the music played its quiet loop, and the room very slowly, incompletely, started trying to be itself again. At the hospital, Eddie Carmichael was in emergency surgery. The attending cardiologist looked at the notes from the paramedic handoff and read the clinical summary that had been relayed from the scene. The summary was precise, correct in every particular. She'd identified the arrhythmia type before the monitors did. The attending said, to no one specifically, "Who did this assessment?" The paramedic said, "Woman at the scene, medical professional, didn't get a name." The attending looked at the paper again. "What kind of medical professional?" The paramedic paused. She said, "Nurse." The attending looked up. "This isn't nurse-level clinical assessment." The paramedic met her eyes. "That's what she said." At Halcyon Bay Naval Station, 3 miles from the Kestrel and Anchor, the lights in the administrative wing were still on at 2100 hours. A set of calls had been placed. A set of notifications had gone out through channels that most people in that building didn't have access to. Someone had reached a point of authority that caused a specific category of response to begin. And in the back of a government SUV, moving through the dark streets of Port Calder, Clara Voss sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked out the window at the lights of the naval station as they passed. She looked tired, but not in the way people look when they're worn out. In the way people look when they're carrying something heavy and they're used to the weight, but the weight is still there. Her phone had been vibrating since they left the bar. She hadn't looked at it. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She didn't notice. She was thinking about Eddie Carmichael. Thinking about the tremor in his left hand. Thinking about whether she'd gotten the aspirin in early enough, and whether the paramedics had caught what she'd flagged, and whether the surgical team was going to see the specific thing in the arrhythmia pattern that she'd noted in the handoff. She was thinking about whether he was going to be okay, and she was not going to know that tonight, and that was the part of this kind of work that never got easier. The SUV turned through the main gate of Halcyon Bay. The MP at the gate saw the plates and waved them through without stopping. Clara leaned her head back against the seat. The 2 officers in the front were not talking. At the Kestrel and Anchor, Briggs had paid his tab and was putting on his coat. He had a look on his face that Pete the bartender had never seen on him before. Not worried exactly. More like the look of a man who has found a loose thread in something and is deciding how hard to pull. He stepped out into the cool October air and stood on the sidewalk where the SUV had been parked. He looked down the street in the direction it had gone. He took out his phone. He knew people. He'd spent 31 years building the kind of network that meant there were numbers in his phone that most people didn't know existed. He found one of them. He made the call. It rang twice. When the person on the other end picked up, Briggs said simply, "I need to know who just left the Kestrel and Anchor in a government vehicle." Woman, early 50s, brown hair. She handled a cardiac arrest like a trauma specialist and a room full of Marines like she'd done it before. A pause. "No," he said. "I'm not going to wait until morning." He stood there under the yellow streetlight, listening. And then the voice on the other end said something. And Briggs was quiet for a very long time. The voice on the other end of the phone belonged to a man named Warren Osk, who had spent 22 years in naval intelligence before taking a position that didn't have a title on any official organizational chart. Briggs had worked with him twice, in circumstances that neither of them discussed, and the fact that Osk picked up on the second ring at 2100 hours on a Thursday said something about how seriously he took calls from people he'd trusted his life to. Briggs listened for 4 minutes without interrupting. When Osk finished, Briggs said, "You're certain?" It wasn't a question. Oska didn't answer it like one. The vehicle registration, the officer escort, the notification protocol that got triggered when she entered the base. "Yes, I'm certain." Briggs looked down the dark street at nothing in particular. A cold front was moving through Port Calder, and the wind off the water had a bite to it that hadn't been there 2 hours ago. He stood in it and felt it and didn't move. "How long has she been in this position?" he said. Confirmed appointment was 14 months ago. But her file before that, Osk paused in the particular way that meant what he was about to say was careful. Her file before that is the kind of file that's mostly gaps. What kind of gaps? The kind that have a classification level attached to them. Briggs absorbed that. He had enough experience to know what kind of career produced a file like that. You didn't get gaps like that from administrative work. You got them from the kind of service that required the people involved to disappear from the record while the work was happening. "All right," he said. "Thank you, Warren." "Briggs," Osk's voice changed register slightly. "The sergeant who gave her trouble tonight, is he yours?" "No, 3rd Battalion, rotating out in 2 days." A pause. 2 days might not be enough time for this to catch up to him. "It'll catch up," Briggs said. He hung up. Stood there another minute. Then he went back inside, sat back down in his corner booth, and ordered a second bourbon he didn't particularly want. He drank it slowly and looked at the empty stool at the end of the bar. Mercer was still there, still not talking much. His guys had slowly redistributed themselves around the pool table, but the energy was different, subdued in the way energy gets when something has happened that nobody knows how to process yet. Dex had come to stand next to Mercer once, said something, and Mercer had shaken his head without turning around. Dex had gone back. Pete the bartender was moving through his closing routines at the edges of his shift, wiping down surfaces, restocking the cooler, doing the things that needed doing. But he kept glancing at the end of the bar, at the space where a woman had sat quietly for 40 minutes and then, in 9 minutes, possibly saved a man's life. He thought about the paramedic's nod. He'd worked 2 tours as a corpsman. He knew what that nod meant. That nod was one professional telling another, "I see what you did, and it was right, and I wouldn't have done it differently." That nod was not something you gave to someone who'd done basic first aid. That nod was something else. He kept wiping the counter. At Halcyon Bay Naval Station, in a conference room on the 2nd floor of the administrative wing, Clara Voss was sitting at a table with 2 people she hadn't planned on seeing tonight. One was Rear Admiral Denton Vale, who commanded the naval installation at Halcyon Bay and was a man she'd interacted with twice in professional contexts over the past year. He was in his dress uniform at 2100 hours on a Thursday, which meant someone had called him in, which meant the notification that had gone out when she'd entered the base had gone higher than the duty officer. The other person was a civilian, a woman in her 40s named Paula Stern, whose title was something with the word liaison in it, but whose actual function was considerably less administrative than the title suggested. Stern had a laptop open in front of her and was not typing on it. Clara looked at both of them. "This didn't need to be tonight." "With respect," Vale said, "we had a situation. You had a man have a cardiac event in a bar. The situation is resolved." "The situation I'm referring to," Vale said carefully, "is the one involving your presence at the Kestrel and Anchor, without notification to this office, and the subsequent—" "I was having a drink," Clara said. Stern glanced at her laptop. "You were observed arriving at 1932, ordering club soda, and spending the next 43 minutes in systematic observation of the room. That's not quite having a drink. Clara looked at her. I observe rooms. That's not a crime. No one is suggesting, why am I in this room? Clara said. Not rudely, just directly, the way she handled things she wanted to move through efficiently. I responded to a medical emergency. The man is in surgery. The outcome looks positive. I was in a public establishment within proximity to the base, and I didn't identify myself to anyone. What specifically requires a conference room? Vale and Stern exchanged a look. Sergeant Roland Mercer, Stern said. Clara waited. His unit departs in 48 hours for a joint exercise with the 3rd Fleet out of Carrington. There's a question of whether tonight's incident was a personal altercation in a civilian establishment, Clara said. Between me and a sergeant who made an incorrect judgment call. I'm not filing a report. Ma'am, I'm not filing a report, she said again, and this time the flatness in her voice made it final. He doesn't need a report. He needs to think about what happened, and he's doing that right now. That's more useful. Another look between Vale and Stern. There's a secondary concern, Vale said. He shifted in his chair slightly. Some people in that bar saw the officer escort, the government vehicle. A few of them are going to ask questions. Let them ask, Clara said. They won't get answers. And if word spreads about who you are, Admiral, she said it quietly. This isn't my first Thursday. Vale closed his mouth. He was a rear admiral, and he had 26 years of service, and he had just been silenced by a woman in a Navy pullover using 4 words. And the thing was, there wasn't anything he could say to push back on it. Because she was right, and because of who she was. Clara stood up. I'll be at the 0800 briefing. I'm going to the hotel now. The duty vehicle can... I'll take a cab. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. Thank you both. This wasn't necessary, but I understand why you called it. She left. Stern looked at Vale. She's not going to report him. She said that. That doesn't mean it ends there. Vale thought about that for a moment. No, he said. It doesn't. The cab took Clara to the Mariner's Rest, a mid-range hotel 4 blocks from the waterfront that she'd stayed at twice before, chosen for reasons of proximity and the fact that it had a decent blackout blind. She tipped the driver in cash, went to her room, and stood in the bathroom for a long moment looking at the smear on her sleeve. She took the sweater off, looked at it for a second, put it in the trash. She ran the water hot and stood at the sink and let her hands soak in it longer than necessary. It was a thing she'd done for years. Not for hygiene, she'd scrubbed already, but because the hot water gave her hands something to do while her head finished processing. Eddie Carmichael. She didn't know him. She still didn't know if he was going to make it through surgery. She'd done everything right, and it still might not be enough, because medicine didn't work the way people wanted it to, didn't resolve neatly into outcomes that matched the effort. You did the work, and then you waited, and sometimes the waiting produced something other than what you needed. She turned off the water, dried her hands, looked at herself in the mirror. She looked tired. That was fine. She was allowed to be tired. Her phone had 17 missed notifications. She went through them in order. 3 from Stern, which she'd deal with tomorrow. 2 from her chief of staff, same. 4 from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be a journalist who'd gotten hold of her personal line somehow and was going to lose it again. 1 from her sister in Portland, asking about Thanksgiving. She sat on the edge of the bed and texted her sister back. Short and real, the way texts to her sister always were. Sorry for the late reply. Yes to Thanksgiving. I'll get there when I get there. How's the dog? She put the phone down. She sat in the quiet of the hotel room and let the night settle around her. 31 years. That was the span of it, if you counted from the beginning. The beginning being a Navy recruitment office in a small town in Western Virginia, where an 18-year-old woman named Clara Voss had walked in on a Tuesday afternoon and changed everything about what her life was going to be. She'd gone in thinking nursing, because that was the track that made sense to her, the one where the skills she'd always had, the ability to stay calm in chaos, the ability to read bodies the way some people read books, could be put to actual use. What happened over the years that followed was more complicated than that. She'd been good. That was the simple version. She'd been so good at what she did that she kept getting pulled toward roles that required more of her, different things, harder things. Field deployments, special operations medical support, Assignments she couldn't talk about to people who weren't cleared to hear them. She'd worked in environments where the clinical standards she'd been trained to uphold had to be adapted in real time to conditions that were nothing like any classroom, any hospital, any training scenario. She'd lost people she tried to save. She'd saved people who should have been lost. She'd learned the difference between what the textbook said and what worked when the textbook wasn't available and the clock was running. At 44, she'd made a transition that surprised almost everyone who knew her. She'd gone into policy. It had seemed on the surface like a retreat, from the field work, from the direct care, from the part of the work that felt most real. But she understood something that not everyone understood. The decisions made in conference rooms shaped what was possible in field hospitals. The resources allocated in budget sessions determined how many people had what they needed when things went wrong. The policy layer was where the systems were, and the systems were where the scale was, and scale was what mattered if you cared about the actual numbers. 14 months ago, she had been appointed Secretary of the Navy. She hadn't told anyone at the bar tonight. She hadn't told anyone at the Kestrel and Anchor who she was, or why the building she was walking into, or what the title on her appointment said. She'd gone in for a drink on a Thursday night because she was in Port Calder for an 0800 briefing, and she'd wanted an hour of quiet in a place that felt like something real rather than another climate-controlled administrative space. She'd wanted to be in a room full of military people and not be anything to any of them. Just a civilian at a bar. Just a woman having a club soda. She lay back on the hotel bed without changing her clothes. The ceiling was the same off-white hotel ceiling that every hotel ceiling was, and she looked at it, and after a while her phone buzzed once with a text from her sister. "Dog is perfect. She ate a shoe. Call me when you surface." Clara almost smiled. She closed her eyes. By 06:30 the next morning, the story had started moving. Not in any official capacity. There was no report filed, no incident documented, no formal notification going through channels. But the Kestrel and Anchor had been full of people the night before, and people talked, and the story that moved through those conversations was already changing shape as it traveled. Some people had it right. Woman at the bar, cardiac event, clinical response that went beyond what anyone expected. Some people had it wrong in various directions, adding details that hadn't been there, or losing the ones that had. What didn't change in any version was the officer escort, the government vehicle. The way the two uniformed men had come into the bar and gone straight to her and called her ma'am, in the voice you used when you were being careful. By 0700, Dex had heard 3 versions from 3 different sources, and none of them quite matched. He found Mercer in the barracks, already up, already dressed, sitting on the edge of his bunk with his hands between his knees, and the look of a man who hadn't slept as much as he'd needed to. "Sarge," Dex stood in the doorway. "You hear what people are saying?" "I hear everything people are saying." Mercer didn't look up. "What specifically?" Dex hesitated. That she wasn't just a nurse. Mercer was quiet. "Briggs left right after she did," Dex said. "Nobody saw him make a call, but he made a call," Mercer said. "But the guys that stayed said he looked different when he came back in, like he'd heard something." Mercer picked up his phone, turned it over in his hand, put it back down. "What do you want me to do about that, Dex?" "I don't know," Dex said honestly. "I just thought you should know that people are talking." "Yeah." Mercer finally looked up. "People always talk. The question is what they're saying and whether it's going to matter." He stood up. "Let's go to chow." The mess hall at 0700 was the normal organized chaos of a base morning, trays and voices, and the particular institutional smell of scrambled eggs that had been under a heat lamp for 20 minutes. Mercer got his food, sat down, and found that the table around him was quieter than usual. Not silent, just quieter. The guys who normally filled the space with the noise of a unit that was comfortable with itself were doing something slightly more careful. He ate his eggs and didn't say anything. Across the mess hall, at a table near the windows, 2 officers he didn't recognize were eating and talking in low voices. They were naval, not marine, different bearing, different insignia. One of them glanced toward Mercer's table and then looked away. He noticed. He kept eating. At 0800, in the same conference room where Clara had sat the night before, the briefing that had been the reason for her presence in Port Calder began. It was a routine strategic review, the kind of meeting that happened at naval installations every quarter, covering force readiness assessments, resource allocation reviews, maintenance, pipeline updates. Clara sat at the head of the table because that was where she sat, and the 12 people around her were a mixture of base leadership, fleet representatives, and administrative personnel who had all received the pre-briefing materials and were prepared to walk through the agenda. What was not routine was that Rear Admiral Vale, when he opened the meeting, looked at Clara for a fraction of a second longer than necessary before he started speaking. She noted it, filed it, said nothing. The briefing ran for 2 hours and covered 3 agenda items, and Clara asked the questions she needed to ask and listened to the answers and pushed back when the answers were incomplete and did not push back when they weren't. She was efficient in meetings in the way she was efficient in most things. Not cold, but focused. And the focus was something people either found clarifying or unsettling, depending on their relationship to having their assumptions examined. They were 40 minutes into the second agenda item, a maintenance backlog review that had numbers in it that she was not happy with, when the door opened. The junior officer who came in was visibly uncomfortable about interrupting. He went to Vale's aide, leaned down, said something. The aide's expression changed. She watched all of this. The aide went to Vale and said something equally low. Vale's expression changed in a different way. "Excuse me," Vale said to the room and got up. He was gone for 6 minutes. Clara knew because she tracked it. The briefing continued around his empty chair because she indicated it should, but the room had a different texture now. When Vale came back in, he looked at Clara. "Ma'am," he said, "there's been a development." She waited. "Sergeant Roland Mercer filed a complaint this morning." Vale said it carefully, like he was placing something fragile on a table. "Through his chain of command. He's alleging that last night a civilian female in the Kestrel and Anchor used physical force against him without provocation." The room went very still. Clara looked at Vale for a moment. "He's alleging that she," Vale continued, "that you initiated physical contact that constituted assault on a Marine non-commissioned officer." One of the fleet representatives, a captain named Gould, said, "That's," and stopped himself. Clara put down her pen. She folded her hands on the table. "What prompted him to file this morning?" "I don't know." "Who in his chain of command received it?" "It went to his battalion commander, Colonel Reese." "And Reese sent it upward?" "Yes." "To you?" "Yes." She looked at the table for a moment, not looking at anything on it, just the pause she allowed herself when she needed to make a decision about tone. "All right," she said, "let's take 20 minutes. Then we'll finish the maintenance review, because those backlog numbers need to be addressed before I leave this base." Vale stared at her. "Ma'am, he filed a complaint, alleging—" "I heard you, Admiral." She picked her pen back up. 20 minutes. She stood up, and the room stood with her, and she walked out. In the hallway, alone, she leaned against the wall and tilted her head back against the cool plaster. Mercer had filed a complaint. She hadn't expected that. Not because he didn't have the right to. He did. The process existed for a reason. But because she'd read him last night as a man who, in the morning light, would think better of escalating. She'd misjudged the depth of the injury to his pride. Or she'd misjudged how someone had advised him. One of the two. It complicated things. Not in ways that were ultimately significant, but in ways that required management, and management took time and attention away from things that mattered more. She took a breath. The thing about this kind of situation, and she'd been in variations of it before, different settings, same basic architecture, was that it had a way of forcing the identity question, the question of who she was and whether that was going to become relevant. She had gone to the Kestrel and Anchor specifically because she hadn't wanted to be the Secretary of the Navy for one evening. She had wanted to be a woman having a drink. And now, because of a sergeant's wounded pride and a bad decision made in the early morning, the thing she'd wanted to keep quiet for one night was going to have to come into the light. Not in the way she would have chosen, not on the timeline she would have preferred. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. It was Stern. "Are you aware of the Mercer complaint? Recommend we discuss before it goes further." She typed back, "I'm aware. Stand by." Down the hall, a door opened. Footsteps. She looked up. It was Briggs. I was in civilian clothes again, same as last night, but he was on the base, which meant he'd come through the gate, which meant he had reason to be here. He stopped when he saw her. He didn't look surprised to see her in the hallway. He looked like a man who'd made a decision to be somewhere and had arrived at the place where the decision would tell him if it was right. They looked at each other. "Master Gunnery Sergeant," she said. Ma'am, he paused. You know who I am. I made some calls last night, too. He was quiet for a moment. Mercer filed a complaint. I know. He's going to regret that. Maybe, she said. That's not my concern right now. Briggs studied her. There was something in his face that wasn't quite apology. He wasn't the type for apology as a first move, but was in the neighborhood of it. I should have stepped in sooner, last night, before he put his hand on you. You stepped in when it was appropriate. That's generous? It's accurate. She looked at him steadily. What are you doing on base? Colonel Reese is a friend, Briggs said. I came to tell him some things about last night that I thought he should know before this goes too far in the wrong direction. Clara was quiet for a moment. What things? That there were 15 witnesses to who made physical contact first. That the medical intervention Mercer interrupted, because that's what he did, he put his hands on someone who had just kept a man alive. That intervention is now a matter of hospital record. And that the woman he filed against has a file that his battalion commander is not going to enjoy reading. She looked at him for a long moment. You didn't have to do that. No, he agreed. I didn't. Why did you? Briggs considered this with the honest weight of someone who wasn't going to give a clean answer to a question that didn't have one. Because he's not a bad Marine, he said finally. He's an arrogant one, which isn't the same thing. And if this goes the wrong direction because nobody corrected the record, he's going to end up destroyed over something that could have been a lesson. That's a waste. She held his gaze. He meant it. That was the thing about Briggs. She'd heard about him now, from the calls she'd made last night, and he was exactly what his record said he was. A man who'd spent 31 years being harder on bad behavior than most, and more patient with people than the hardness suggested. How much does Reese know, she said. Enough that he's not going to let this go anywhere without being very, very careful. She nodded once, started to say something, and then her phone rang. Not the cell. The secure line. The one that was for a specific category of contact. She looked at the screen. The number was the direct line for the Chief of Naval Operations. She looked up at Briggs. Something in her face shifted. Not alarm, but the particular kind of recalibration that happened when a situation that was one size became another size very quickly. I need to take this, she said. Briggs nodded and stepped back. She answered. Voss. The voice on the other end was Admiral Harlan Price, CNO, the highest uniformed naval officer in the country, and he was not calling about the maintenance backlog. Clara, he said. He was one of the few people who used her first name in a professional call, and the fact that he was doing it now told her something. I need you to tell me what happened last night. She turned slightly away from Briggs. How much do you know already? I know a complaint was filed. I know by whom. I know against whom. A beat. I know what the hospital is saying about the cardiac arrest response. What are they saying? That whoever did the field assessment at the bar saved that man's life. Possibly twice over, given the arrhythmia pattern they found when they got him open. Another beat. They're asking who trained her. Clara closed her eyes for 1 second, just one. Harlan, she said, this doesn't need to become... A sergeant in the United States Marine Corps filed an assault complaint against the Secretary of the Navy, Price said. Clara, it's already something. She opened her eyes. Down the hall, Briggs was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the middle distance, giving her privacy by direction of his gaze, if not by distance. The conference room door was still closed. 20 minutes was running out. She thought about Mercer sitting at that bar last night, hand dropped, face red, needing to reassert something. She thought about what Briggs had said, not a bad Marine, an arrogant one, and she thought about the difference between those two things and whether that difference was going to matter. What do you need from me? She said. Price was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into the register he used for things that were going to have consequences. I need you to stay in Port Calder until I get there. Clara's hand tightened slightly on the phone. When? 1800, Price said. I'm already on a flight. She stayed on the line for another 40 seconds while Price gave her the logistics. Flight out of Andrews, ETA to Halcyon Bay at 17:45, small advance team ahead of him. And then she said, I'll be here, and ended the call. She stood in the hallway for a moment with the phone in her hand. 1800. That gave her 8 hours in which the situation was going to continue developing without the thing that would resolve it, which was Price's presence and the authority it carried. 8 hours in which Mercer's complaint was sitting in Colonel Reese's inbox, in which the hospital was asking questions about her clinical background, in which the story from the Kestrel and Anchor was moving through the base at the speed that stories moved on bases, which was fast, and which warped things as it went. She put the phone in her pocket and turned back to Briggs. "Price is coming," she said. Something moved across Briggs's face. "The CNO." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "How bad is this going to get for Mercer?" "That," she said, "depends on choices that haven't been made yet." She looked at him directly, including his. She went back into the conference room. 12 people looked up. She sat down, picked up her pen, and said, "The maintenance backlog. Captain Gould, you were saying the pipeline delay on the destroyer class was a parts issue, not a labor issue. Walk me through the parts." Gould blinked. Then he found his place in the briefing materials and walked her through it. Colonel Raymond Reese had been commanding 3rd Battalion for 3 years, and in that time he had dealt with a range of disciplinary matters that covered most of the spectrum: conduct issues, insubordination, the occasional incident that required the kind of careful documentation that protected the unit as much as the individual. He was good at his job, and he was fair, and he had the specific quality of leadership that involved being harder on bad behavior from people he liked than from people he didn't, because he understood that you didn't do people favors by going easy on them when it mattered. When Mercer's complaint landed on his desk at 0720, Reese had read it twice and then sat with it for 10 minutes without doing anything. Then Briggs had arrived. He and Briggs had known each other for 11 years. Briggs had served under him for 11 years. Briggs had served under him briefly, early in Reese's command career, and the relationship had outlasted the service structure because that was the kind of relationship it was. When Briggs came in, Reese waved him to a chair, and Briggs sat down, and for the next 20 minutes told him what he'd seen the night before with the precision of someone who'd spent 31 years learning how to observe things correctly. When Briggs finished, Reese looked at the complaint on his desk. "You're telling me there are 15 witnesses," he said. "At minimum. Some of them are his own guys. And she didn't initiate contact." He put his hand on her first. "I saw it. Pete Alderman saw it. 3 of Mercer's own men saw it." Reese picked up the complaint. "Read it again. Set it back down." "He's alleging the reverse." "I know. That's a problem." "That's his problem," Briggs said. "The question is whether you let it become yours." Reese looked at him. "Who is she?" Briggs told him. Reese was quiet for a longer moment than he'd been quiet yet. "The CNO is coming," Briggs added. "Of course he is." Reese pushed back from his desk and stood up. He walked to the window, which looked out over the parade ground where the morning detail was moving through its routine in the early gray light. He watched it for a moment. "Where is Mercer now?" "Mess hall, or was 20 minutes ago." "Get him here," Reese said. "Not summoned. You go get him yourself, and you bring him here, and you don't tell him why on the way." Briggs stood. "And the complaint?" Reese looked at it on the desk. "It sits right there until I know everything I need to know." Mercer sat across from Reese in the colonel's office at 0915 with the posture of a man who was trying to hold a position he'd already lost and didn't know it yet. He'd been surprised to see Briggs in the mess hall. He'd been more surprised when Briggs had said quietly, "The colonel wants to see you," and hadn't given him anything else. The walkover had been long enough for Mercer's mind to run through the possibilities, and he'd arrived at an arrangement of the facts that he found defensible, and he was holding on to it. Reese had the complaint on the desk, but he hadn't touched it since Mercer sat down. "Tell me what happened," Reese said. "Not aggressively, just waiting," Mercer told him. He told it the way people tell things when they're trying to be honest, but also trying to shape the telling. The editing was subtle, but Reese was a man who'd listened to a lot of people tell him things, and he could hear the shape of what was being left out as clearly as what was being put in. When Mercer finished, Reese said, "You put your hand on her arm." A beat. "To direct her toward the exit, sir. She wasn't—" "You put your hand on her arm," Reese said again. Same tone. Not a question the second time. Mercer's jaw worked. "Yes, sir." "Before she touched you." The silence was its own answer. "Sergeant," Reese said, and his voice was the voice of a man being patient in a way that had a cost attached to it. "I have your complaint. I also have 3 signed statements from members of your own unit confirming the sequence of contact. He let that sit for a moment. Do you understand what that means for the complaint you filed? Mercer looked at the desk. Sir, I filed it because I know why you filed it. Reese leaned forward slightly. You filed it because you were embarrassed, and you wanted the record to say something different than what happened. I understand that. I've been around long enough to understand that. He paused. But the record says what it says, and we have witnesses. And what you filed this morning is not consistent with what those witnesses saw. The color that came into Mercer's face was different from the color last night. Last night it had been the flush of a man asserting himself. This was the color of a man understanding what he'd done. Who is she? He said. Reese looked at him for a long moment. That's the wrong question, Roland, and the fact that it's the question you're asking tells me where your head still is. Mercer met his eyes. Sir, the right question, Reese said, is what you're going to do about what you filed this morning, and what you're going to do about who you were last night. He sat back. I'm going to give you until 1600 to think about that. Well, the morning moved the way. Mornings moved on bases when something was happening underneath the surface of the routine, everything proceeding as it was supposed to, formations and training rotations and administrative functions all running on schedule, but with a particular quality of attention underneath it, everyone oriented slightly toward the thing that wasn't being said aloud. By noon, more of the story had traveled. The hospital had released an update on Eddie Carmichael, out of surgery, stable, in cardiac ICU. The attending cardiologist had spoken to the chief of medicine about the field assessment notes, and that conversation had gone somewhere, because by early afternoon the chief of medicine had reached out to the naval station asking, through official channels, for the name of the medical professional who had been on scene. The request landed on Vale's desk. He sent it to Stern. Stern called Clara. Clara was in her hotel room, working through the documentation backlog that her chief of staff had been flagging for 2 days, and she picked up on the second ring. She listened to Stern explain the hospital's request. She thought about Eddie Carmichael in a cardiac ICU. She thought about the cardiologist who'd asked what kind of medical professional. Give them my name, she said. Ma'am, if they know your name, they're going to... Give them my name, she said again, and tell them I'll call the attending this afternoon. She hung up and went back to the documentation. At 1400, she called the attending cardiologist, a woman named Dr. Miriam Taft, who had a voice that was brisk and precise and who did not waste time. The arrhythmia signature you noted in the handoff, Taft said, without preamble. The specific pattern, how did you identify it? Left hand tremor at rest combined with the lip color and the breathing cadence, Clara said. The combination suggested something beyond a standard STEMI. The tremor specifically pointed to potential involvement of the autonomic nervous system, which in a man of his age with a stent history implied torsades de pointes, Taft said, which is exactly what we found when we got in. A pause. You identified that in a bar, without monitors, without any diagnostic equipment. I've seen it before, Clara said. Another pause. Longer. Where does a nurse see that in a field context? Clara considered how much to say. Deployments, she said. A long time ago. Taft was quiet for a moment. He's going to make it, Mr. Carmichael. The surgical outcome was good, better than it might have been if the initial assessment had sent us down the wrong path. I'm glad. So am I. Taft's voice shifted slightly, still professional, but with something underneath it. I wanted you to know that, since I suspect you've been thinking about it. Clara looked at the window of her hotel room, at the slice of gray sky above the waterfront. Thank you for calling, she said. Thank you, Taft said, for being in that bar. After she hung up, Clara sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. The relief was real. It didn't look like much from the outside. She didn't move, didn't exhale dramatically, didn't do any of the things that signaled emotion in a legible way. But it was there, the quiet unwinding of something that had been held tight since 9 minutes on a bar floor the night before. She let herself have 30 seconds of it. Then she opened her laptop and went back to work. At 15:47, Mercer appeared at Colonel Reese's office door. He was in dress uniform. He hadn't been told to wear it. Reese noticed that and filed it somewhere. Mercer came in and stood at parade rest in front of the desk, which was also his own call. Reese looked at him. I want to withdraw the complaint, Mercer said. All right. And I want... He stopped. Started again. I'd like to request the opportunity to speak with her directly. With the civilian. With... He stopped again, and the stop was more honest than anything he'd said in Reese's office that morning, because it was the stop of a man who didn't know the correct form of address for what he was about to say and was understanding why for the first time. I don't actually know her name, sir. Reese looked at him steadily. No, he said. You don't. The silence in the office had the quality of something being weighed. Her name is Clara Voss, Reese said. She is the Secretary of the Navy. He watched Mercer's face go through several things in quick succession, none of them clean. She arrived in Port Calder yesterday for a routine strategic briefing at this installation. She spent the evening before that briefing at the Kestrel and Anchor, where she was not identified to anyone as anything other than a civilian, which was her right. He leaned forward. She was in that bar, Sergeant, as a person, not as a title, and you treated her the way you treated her. Mercer's jaw was tight. His hands, at parried rest behind his back, were probably doing something they wouldn't be doing if they were visible. The complaint withdrawal, Reese said. I'll process it. The matter of your conduct is separate. He paused. Admiral Price is arriving at 1745. He's going to want to understand what happened and why. And I'm going to need you to be completely honest with him in a way that you were not completely honest with me this morning. Mercer's throat moved. Yes, sir. Go in the anteroom. Oh. Price's plane landed at 1738 at the Naval Air Facility attached to Halcyon Bay. He was in his dress blues and he came off the aircraft with 2 aides and the kind of controlled efficiency of a man who had decided before he landed exactly what needed to happen and was here to make it happen. He went first to the conference room where Clara was waiting. She was in the same clothes she'd been in all day. She'd gone back to the hotel, changed into a fresh version of the same practical thing, slacks and a dark jacket. And she was standing at the window when he came in, not sitting, because she'd been sitting for most of the day and she was tired of it. Price came in and the aide stayed outside and he closed the door. Clara. Harlan. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had a lot he could say and was deciding how much of it was necessary. They'd known each other for 15 years, which was long enough to skip some of the preamble. How are you? He said. I'm fine. I'm annoyed. At him or at the situation? At myself, she said, for not anticipating that he'd escalate. She turned from the window. That was a misread. You were having a drink. I was on a base installation adjacent to active military units, she said. I should have... She stopped. It doesn't matter. What matters is what happens now. What happens now, Price said, is that I speak to the sergeant. Then I speak to the colonel. Then we make some decisions about how this is documented and what it means. It doesn't need to mean anything that derails him, Clara said. He made a bad call in a bar. He made a worse call this morning, but his service record before this is good, Price said. I know, I looked. Then treat it like what it is. A man who needed to learn something and had a bad week learning it. Price studied her. You're being more generous than you should be. I'm being accurate, she said. There's a difference. He was quiet for a moment. The hospital is going to release a statement about the cardiac case. Carmichael. They want to acknowledge the first responder. Clara shook her head. Ask them not to. Not yet. Clara, I'm not ready for that to be the story, she said. Not while this other thing is still unresolved. If my clinical background gets into the news while Mercer's complaint is still a live document, it looks like justification. Like the point is that I deserve to be treated differently because of my credentials. That's not the point. Price frowned. What is the point? That she deserved to be treated with basic decency because she was a person sitting in a bar. She said it without heat. The rest is irrelevant. He held her gaze for a long moment. All right, he said. I'll ask Taft to hold the statement. He left to find Mercer. Clara stood in the empty conference room and looked at the table. 12 chairs, water carafes, the dry erase board with the morning's agenda still partially visible, and thought about the word irrelevant and whether she fully believed it. She did. Mostly. But there was a part of her that was 51 years old and had spent 31 years being underestimated in rooms that looked a lot like this one, and that part was tired in a way that didn't have a clean solution. You couldn't fix tired like that with a resolution. You could only keep going and try to make the going mean something. She sat down at the table. She picked up her pen. She opened the maintenance backlog report that she still hadn't finished reviewing and found her place. In a small anteroom 2 hallways away, Mercer sat in a chair and waited. He'd been sitting for 40 minutes. The waiting was its own thing, active, uncomfortable, the kind that made you examine what you were thinking in the absence of anything else to do. He'd gone through it several times already. The bar. The moment he'd crossed the room. The decision to put his hand on her arm. The 9 minutes he'd watched her work on Eddie Carmichael. The morning, the complaint, the thing he'd written down and signed and handed to the duty officer. Dex had texted him twice. He hadn't answered. He thought about what Briggs had said to him in the mess hall. Nothing much, just the colonel wants to see you. But the way he'd said it. The look on his face that wasn't anger, but was something more demanding than anger, which was disappointment in someone you'd expected more from. He thought about the paramedic's nod. He'd seen it, from across the bar. He'd seen the paramedic look up at the woman who'd just briefed her and give her that nod, and he hadn't known what it meant at the time, but he'd understood enough to know it meant something he didn't have a category for yet. He was starting to build the category. The door opened. The man who came in was in dress blues, 4 stars on his shoulder boards, and Mercer was on his feet before his brain had time to run the calculation. Admiral Harlan Price, Chief of Naval Operations, stood in the doorway of the anteroom at Halcyon Bay Naval Station and looked at Sergeant Roland Mercer with the expression of a man who had seen a great number of things in his career and was deciding where this one landed on the spectrum. "Sit down, Sergeant," he said. Mercer sat. Price pulled up the other chair, turned it around, and sat with his arms folded on the back of it. The posture was deliberate, not the posture of authority asserting itself from distance, but the posture of someone who intended to have a real conversation and didn't want the furniture in the way. "Tell me about last night," Price said. "All of it. Start from when you first noticed her." Mercer told him. This time, he didn't try to shape the telling. He told it straight, and straight was worse in some ways and better in others, and the parts that were worse were the parts he'd been avoiding thinking about directly. When he finished, Price was quiet for a moment. "The complaint this morning," he said. "I want to withdraw it, sir." "I know, the colonel told me." Price looked at him. "What I want to know is why you filed it." Mercer was quiet for long enough that it was honest. "Because I was embarrassed," he said, "and because I wanted the record to say something different than what happened." Price nodded slowly. "That's the right answer. It's also a very bad reason." He paused. "You understand that filing a false complaint against any individual is a serious matter. You understand that the individual in question, in this case, holds a position that makes it considerably more serious." "Yes, sir." "Do you know who she is?" "Colonel Reese told me." Price watched him. "What did you think when he told you?" Mercer's jaw moved. "I thought I'd made a very large mistake, sir." "You made several," Price said. "The one in the bar was the first. The one this morning was worse, because you had time to think about it." He leaned forward slightly. "But I'm more interested in the first one, the one in the bar, because the one this morning is a consequence. The first one is a pattern." Mercer looked at him. "You walked across a bar," Price said, "and told a woman she didn't belong. You made that judgment based on what she looked like and where she was sitting and the fact that she wasn't wearing a uniform. Is that right?" "Yes, sir." "And now you know that was wrong. Not because of who she is. I want you to be clear on that distinction. It was wrong because it was wrong. Her title doesn't make it wrong. Her clinical background doesn't make it wrong." Price held his gaze. "What makes it wrong is that you looked at a person and decided you knew what she was worth before she'd said 10 words to you." The room was very quiet. "Yes, sir," Mercer said. His voice was different than it had been at any point in the conversation. Lower, simpler. The voice of someone who'd arrived somewhere they didn't want to be and knew they needed to stay there for a minute. Price stood. He put the chair back the way it had been. "Secretary Voss has declined to pursue formal action," he said. "That is her right and her call, and I want you to understand that what she's doing by not pursuing it is giving you something you need to think carefully about what to do with." He moved toward the door, stopped. "Your unit rotates out day after tomorrow." "Yes, sir." "You're going to Carrington, 3rd Fleet exercise." Price turned and looked at him one more time. "You're going to bring back every man under your command. That's your job. That's your actual job. He paused. I suggest you spend some time between now and departure thinking about what it means to see the people around you accurately. Because in the field, that skill saves lives. And right now, Sergeant, you are not good at it. He opened the door and then stopped. Because in the hallway, 20 feet away, Clara Voss was standing with Colonel Reese and Rear Admiral Vale, and she was looking at the open door and her eyes met Mercer's across the distance. He stood. The hallway was completely still. Clara looked at Mercer for a long moment. Not with anger, not with the cold satisfaction of someone who had won something, with the same directness she'd had in the bar, just seeing him, all of him, with the particular quality of attention that didn't flinch and didn't perform and didn't give him anything to push back against because there was nothing there except clear sight. She nodded once. Short. Acknowledgement, not absolution. Then she turned back to Reese and said something about the 0800 report, and the conversation continued, and Mercer was left standing in the anteroom doorway, understanding that he had just been seen by someone who had every reason to make him small and had chosen not to, and that somehow that was harder to hold than punishment would have been. Price glanced at him one last time, kept walking. The door to the anteroom swung most of the way shut. Mercer stood there. From down the hall, he could hear Clara's voice, measured, precise, moving through something administrative with the focus of a person who had a lot of work to do and intended to do it. He couldn't make out the words, just the tone. He was still standing there when his phone buzzed. He looked at it. It was a message from the duty officer, Sergeant Mercer. Report to battalion admin at 1830 for formal review documentation. Bring your service record. He read it twice. He looked down the hallway where Clara Voss had been standing. She was gone. He pulled on his cover, squared it, and started down the corridor toward battalion admin, and he was 2/3 of the way there when his radio crackled, and the voice of his comms sergeant, Tally, came through with the specific tight quality that meant something had happened. Sergeant Mercer, we've got a situation. He slowed. What kind? One of ours. Private Dex Ibarra. He was in the training yard for the 1600 run. They're saying he went down. A beat. Sarge, they're saying he's not responding. Mercer was already moving. He hit the double doors at the end of the corridor at a run. The service record review forgotten. The afternoon forgotten. Everything narrowing down to the training yard. And the words not responding, and the particular cold clarity that came over him when his body understood something was wrong before his brain finished the sentence. He came through the doors into the late afternoon gray and saw the cluster of people in the training yard, 30 meters out, and the figure on the ground, and he was running. But someone else was already there. Clara Voss was crouched beside Dex Ibarra on the concrete of the training yard, her jacket off and folded under his head, and her hands were moving, and she was talking to him in that same voice. Low, steady, the voice that had no room for panic because there was no time for it. And around her 4 Marines stood in a ring, too close, and she said without looking up, "Give him room, back up." And they backed up, because she said it like that, like there was no version of this where they didn't. Mercer arrived at the edge of the ring and stopped. She looked up. Found him in 1 second flat. "Sergeant," she said, "does he have any history of cardiac arrhythmia in his medical file? Any family history?" He stared at her. "Mercer." Her voice didn't rise. "Medical history. Do you know it?" "No," he said. I don't know." "All right." She looked back at Dex. "Get me the base medic, now. And somebody call the clinic and tell them we're incoming with a possible cardiac event in a 22-year-old male. Tell them we need a full panel ready." Mercer was already on his radio. She kept working, and it hit him, standing there on the concrete of the training yard watching her hands move over one of his men with the same precise authority she'd brought to a bar floor the night before. The thought that came in under all the noise of the moment, quiet and specific and impossible to put back once it arrived. This woman has been doing this her entire life, and last night you put your hand on her arm and told her she didn't belong. He spoke into the radio. His voice was steady because he'd been trained to keep it steady, but his hands were not. The base medic arrived 4 minutes after Mercer's radio call. 4 minutes was the standard response time for the training yard, and it was 4 minutes that Clara spent on the concrete beside Dex Ibarra, doing the work that the 4 minutes required. She'd established that he was breathing, shallow, irregular, but breathing. and that his pulse was present but wrong in the specific way that made her keep 2 fingers at his carotid and count. She talked to him the whole time. He was semi-conscious, cycling in and out, and she kept her voice at the same low frequency regardless of whether he appeared to be hearing it. The talking wasn't for her. Mercer stayed at the edge of the ring and kept his people back and relayed information into the radio and did not take his eyes off her hands. When the medic arrived, a young staff sergeant named Ortega, who moved fast and carried his kit like he knew what was in it, Clara gave him the same 60-second handoff she'd given the paramedics the night before. Vitals, timeline, her assessment of the rhythm irregularity, what she'd ruled out and what she hadn't. Ortega listened and set up his portable monitor without wasting emotion. The monitor came on. The line ran across the screen. Ortega looked at it. Then he looked at Clara. "You were right," he said. "Supraventricular tachycardia." "Vagal maneuver first," she said. "If that doesn't convert, we'll need adenosine, and that means the clinic." "Agreed." He positioned Dex and began the maneuver. Clara watched the monitor. 30 seconds. The line stuttered, held, and then, not smoothly, not cleanly, with a hiccup that made Ortega exhale hard through his nose, converted. The rhythm normalized. Dex Ibarra opened his eyes. He looked at the sky above Port Calder, gray and cooling into evening, and then he looked at the woman crouched beside him, and his expression was the expression of someone who was confused about several things at once and lacked the resources to address all of them. "Hey," Clara said. "You're okay. Don't sit up yet." "What?" His voice came out scraped. "You went down during the run. Your heart was doing something it shouldn't. It's corrected now." She kept her hand on his wrist, monitoring. "We're going to get you to the clinic for a full workup. Don't argue about it." I wasn't going to argue." He blinked, looked past her, found Mercer standing at the edge of the ring, and something in his face, something young, something that hadn't finished deciding yet how much of what he felt was allowed to show, went briefly unguarded. "Sarge?" "I'm here," Mercer said. "You're fine. Do what she says." The gurney arrived from the clinic at a jog, 2 corpsmen behind it. Clara stood and stepped back and let them take over, and the handoff was clean and efficient, and Dex was moving toward the clinic building within 90 seconds of the gurney arriving. Ortega went with him. Clara picked up her jacket from the concrete. There was a smudge on the left knee of her slacks where she'd been kneeling. She looked at it briefly and decided it was the least of the evening's concerns. The ring of Marines around her had not dispersed. 6 men, maybe 7, some from Mercer's unit, some from the base, standing in the loose configuration of people who'd been told to back up, and had, but who hadn't gone anywhere. They were looking at her with the particular quality of attention that she'd been on the receiving end of twice now in 24 hours. And it was different from the attention in the bar. The bar had been shock. This was something that had already moved past shock into something that didn't have a clean name, a kind of recalibration happening in real time, visible if you knew what to look for. She put her jacket on. Price had come out of the building at some point during the response. He was standing 15 feet back and he hadn't interfered. And when Clara looked at him now, he gave her the smallest possible nod. The nod of someone who had just watched something confirm something he already knew. Rear Admiral Vale was beside him. Vale looked like a man who was doing rapid arithmetic and not enjoying the results. Mercer was still standing at the edge of where the ring had been. The other men had started to move now, back toward the building, toward their routines, with the deliberate normalizing behavior of people who needed something to do. But Mercer hadn't moved. He was looking at the patch of concrete where Dex had been lying. Then he looked up at Clara. She met his eyes for a moment. Then she walked past him toward the building, and as she passed, she said quietly, without stopping, "He'll be fine. SVT and a man his age with no prior history. They'll run the workup, rule out underlying causes. He'll probably be on monitoring for a cycle and then cleared." She didn't wait for him to respond. She went inside. The formal review session that had been scheduled for 1830 in Battalion Admin had been quietly moved to 1900 and then 1930 by the time the training yard situation resolved itself. When it finally convened, in the same conference room that had hosted the morning briefing, because there were only so many conference rooms at Halcyon Bay, the attendees were Admiral Price, Rear Admiral Vale, Colonel Reese, Clara, and a JAG officer named Major Felicity Dunbar, who had arrived on the same flight as Price and had spent the intervening hours reviewing documentation. Mercer was not in the room. He was in the anteroom again, which had begun to feel like his default position in this building. Dunbar had the complaint on the table in front of her and a legal pad beside it that was already half full of notes. She was in her early 40s, spare and methodical, with the quality of someone who processed information by writing it down and then looking at what she'd written from a slight distance. "The complaint has been formally withdrawn," she said. "That's on record. The withdrawal itself creates a documentation trail that doesn't disappear simply because the original filing is retracted." She looked around the table. "What I need to know from this room is what outcome we're seeking and what the appropriate procedural path is to get there." "We're not seeking punitive outcome," Clara said. Dunbar looked at her. "Ma'am, the filing itself was a bad decision made by a man who was embarrassed and wasn't thinking clearly about the consequences." Clara folded her hands on the table. "That's not a character statement. That's an accurate description of what happened and why." She paused. "What I want is a conduct review that goes on his record, a formal counseling session with Reese and Price, and a standing order that he complete the base's professional ethics refresher before his unit deploys." The room was quiet. "That's it?" Vale said. "That's proportionate," Clara said. Dunbar was writing. "And the conduct in the bar, the physical contact." "Addressed by the conduct review," Clara's voice was even. "We don't need a separate track for something that was resolved on the night it happened." Price was watching her from across the table. He wasn't interfering. He'd known her long enough to know when she'd made a decision that was final and when she was still working toward one, and this was the first kind. Reese said, "He's a good Marine, Clara." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm not trying to end his career over one bad night and one worse morning." She looked at Reese directly. "But the conduct review stands. This doesn't disappear. He needs to carry it forward and do something with it." Reese nodded. "Agreed." "Then I think we're done with this part," Clara said. She looked at Dunbar. "What do you need from me to close the documentation?" Dunbar told her. It took 12 minutes. When it was done, Clara signed where she needed to sign, and the complaint was officially resolved, and the outcome was exactly what she'd said it would be. Proportionate, documented, and designed not to destroy, but to correct. After the others filed out, Price stayed. "You know," he said when they were alone, "most people in your position would have let this go considerably further. Most people in my position haven't spent 30 years watching careers get ended by situations that should have been lessons," she said. She was gathering her papers, efficient, not looking at him. "Punitive outcomes feel satisfying in the moment. They're frequently wasteful." "He put his hands on you." "And I addressed it." She looked up. "Right there in the bar. In the moment. That's where it should have been addressed." She paused. "The complaint this morning was the part that required the formal process, not the bar." Price was quiet for a moment. "The training yard. Yes. Second cardiac response in 24 hours. Yes. Clara." He said her name with the weight of someone who'd been holding something for a while and had decided to set it down. "When's the last time you took leave?" She considered this. Define leave. "Not working." "Then I'd have to think about it." She closed her folder. "I'm fine, Harlan." "I didn't say you weren't." He looked at her steadily. "I said you haven't taken leave." She picked up her jacket. "I'll think about it." He knew that tone. He let it go. At 2045, Clara went to the base clinic. Not because she'd been asked to. Not because there was a clinical reason for her presence there. She went because Dexabara was in bed 3 of the monitoring ward, and she had spent portions of the last hour thinking about the fact that a 22-year-old Marine with no prior cardiac history had gone down in a training yard, and the part of her that was still, underneath everything else, a person who had sat with patients through difficult nights, needed to see that he was genuinely all right. The duty nurse, a warrant officer named Santos, who had the composed, slightly worn look of someone 3/4 of the way through a long shift, glanced up when she came in. Santos had been briefed, apparently, because he said, "Bed 3, ma'am," without being asked, and then went back to his documentation. Dex was awake. He was in the monitoring bed with the leads attached and an IV line running a saline drip, and he looked better, color back, no more of the grayish quality that had been present on the training yard concrete. He had his phone in his hand but wasn't looking at it when Clara came in. He saw her and did the thing that military people reflexively did when someone of standing came into a room, which was to start to sit up straighter. She waved it off before he got far. "Don't," she said. "You're in a hospital bed. You're allowed to be in a hospital bed." He settled back, watched her pull up the chair beside him. "You don't have to be here." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "They said SVT." "Yes." "They said it might not happen again, or it might." He turned the phone over in his hand. "The cardiologist said we'd run more tests." "That's right. They'll look for structural causes, channelopathies, a few other things. Most of the time with isolated SVT in young patients and no family history, it's idiopathic, no underlying cause, and it's manageable." She paused. "But they need to rule out the other things first. That's what the testing is for." "Is it going to affect my deployment?" She looked at him. He was 22 years old, and he was lying in a monitoring bed, and the question he was asking was whether he was going to be able to go with his unit. She understood that question. She'd spent enough years in enough rooms where that question was the only question that mattered to the person asking it. "I don't know," she said. "That depends on what the testing shows. I'm not going to tell you something comfortable that might not be true." He absorbed that. "Okay." Then after a moment, "Sergeant Mercer. He was right there when they brought me in." "He was the one who called it in," she said. Dex looked at the ceiling for a moment. "He's been different today, since this morning. Everybody noticed." Clara didn't say anything. "I don't know what happened," Dex said. "With you, last night. I heard things, but I don't know what's true." "Then let it stay uncertain," she said. "It's not your part of this story." He looked at her. Something in his face was working through something. "You're the Secretary of the Navy." "Yes." "And you're sitting in a hospital chair next to my bed." "Yes." He looked at the ceiling again, blew out a slow breath. "I don't know what to say to that." "You don't have to say anything." She stood. "Get some sleep. Let them run the tests. Focus on that." She was at the door when he said, "Hey." She turned. "Thank you," he said. "Both times." She looked at him for a moment. "Get better, Private." She went out. In the corridor, she stood for a second with her back against the wall outside his room. The clinic was quiet, the specific late evening quiet of medical facilities, the background hum of monitors, and the distant sound of someone's shoes on linoleum, and the sense of the building doing its ongoing work of keeping people stable. She was tired. She was actually genuinely tired, the kind that didn't have a tactical response. And she let herself know that for 30 seconds in the empty corridor, and then she pushed off the wall and went to find the exit. The story broke at 06:30 the following morning. Not in the way she'd have preferred, not in the way she'd managed the hospital's statement request, not in any version that she'd had the chance to shape. It broke because someone had been in the Kestrel and Anchor on Thursday night with a phone, and the video, 43 seconds, shaky, taken from the far end of the bar, showed enough. It showed Mercer's approach. It showed the exchange. It showed, from a distance and at an angle, the moment his hand came down from her arm. It showed, very clearly, her walking back to her stool and sitting down like nothing had happened. It didn't have audio clear enough to make out words. It didn't need to. The caption, when it went up on a veteran's forum at some point in the early morning hours, said, "Marine Sergeant tries to throw a woman out of a military bar. She didn't flinch." 20 minutes later, she kept a retired vet alive until the paramedics arrived. Anyone know who she is? By 0630, it had 40,000 views. By 0800, it had considerably more. Clara found out when Stern called her at 0641 with the tone of someone who'd been awake for a while already. "It's moving fast," Stern said. "We need to decide how to respond." "Don't respond," Clara said. She was already dressed, already into her second cup of coffee, already looking at the briefing materials for the day. "Not yet. If we don't respond, other people will fill the vacuum. Let them fill it for a few hours." She turned a page in the briefing. "I want to see where it settles before we say anything official." "Ma'am, the video clearly shows—" "Stern." Clara set her coffee down. "I know what the video shows. I was there." She paused. 4 hours. Then we talk about response." She hung up. She sat at the small desk in her hotel room and looked at the window. The sky over Port Calder was doing something indecisive, Not quite rain, not quite clear. And the waterfront was gray and still in the early light. She had not wanted this. The video, the forum post, the cascade that was already building. She'd wanted the whole thing to be a conversation between the people who were in the room, Mercer, Reese, Price, herself, and to resolve in the way it had resolved, quietly and proportionately, and then to be over. What was happening now was a different thing, a public thing, the kind that took on its own momentum. She thought about Mercer, about what it would mean for him to have this in the news cycle. She called Price at 0700. "I've seen it," he said before she could start. "We need to get ahead of it on his behalf," she said. "Not for his sake alone, for the sake of what it becomes if we don't." "What are you thinking?" "A statement that's accurate but doesn't make him the story. The story is the response, the medical response. The story is Eddie Carmichael and Dex Ibarra." She paused. "Mercer is a detail in that story, not the headline." Price was quiet for a moment. "He's already the headline, Clara. The forum post made him the headline." "Then we give them a different headline." She could hear him thinking. "The hospital statement, Carmichael. Dr. Taft has been waiting to release it. Let her release it now. Coordinate it with a brief statement from this office acknowledging the response at the Kestrel and Anchor." She picked up her coffee. "Don't name me by title in the first wave. Let the background come out on its own. It'll come out, it always does. But if it comes out naturally, it reads differently than if we announce it. That's a fine line. I know how to walk fine lines." He was quiet again, longer this time. "All right," he said. "I'll call Taft. You draft the statement language and send it to Stern. I'll send it in 20 minutes. She did. By 1000, the story had shifted. The hospital released Dr. Taft's statement at 0830, and it was precise and unembellished and said exactly what needed to be said, that a patient admitted Thursday night following a cardiac event at a local establishment had survived in part due to the quality of the pre-hospital clinical intervention, that the assessment performed on scene had been accurate and consequential, and that the medical team wished to acknowledge the first responders' contribution to Mr. Carmichael's positive outcome. It named Clara Voss as a nurse and former Navy medical specialist. It did not name her title. It didn't matter. By 0915, 3 different military news outlets had run the background, and by 1000, the Forum Post's comment section had turned into something else entirely. Still moving fast, still messy in the way public attention was always messy, but with a different current underneath it. The framing had shifted from who is she to what she did, and the distance between those two questions was significant. Clara read none of it. She had work to do. She was in the conference room at Halcyon Bay for a 0900 session with Vail and 2 fleet logistics officers, working through the second half of the maintenance backlog that the day before's interruptions had left unfinished, and she stayed with it until the numbers made sense, which took until just past noon. At 12:15, Reese appeared at the conference room door. She looked up. "He wants to see you," Reese said. "Mercer, before his unit rotates." The departure had been pushed by 6 hours. Routine adjustment, unrelated to the previous 2 days, and they were now wheels up at 1600. "I told him I'd ask. I'm not ordering it." Clara considered this. "Is it going to help him or just make him feel better?" "I think," Reese said carefully, "that those might be the same thing this time." She looked at her papers. Then she capped her pen. 10 minutes, she said. Conference room B. Shoal. Mercer came in without his cover. He was holding it, the way you held it when you were inside and wanted to be correct about the small things because you weren't sure about the larger ones. He stood at the door for a moment, and she gestured to the chair across from her, and he sat. He looked like he hadn't slept much. His eyes had the quality of someone who'd been through a night of thinking that didn't resolve into anything clean. He'd shaved, though. His uniform was correct. The small things, again. "I wanted to say..." He stopped. Tried again. "I know you declined formal action. I know what that means, and I'm not going to pretend I don't know what it cost you not to push it further." He looked at her directly, which she gave him credit for. "I'm not going to tell you I understand what I did. I think I'm still figuring that out. But I know I was wrong, and I know the complaint was worse than wrong, and I know..." He paused again, and the pause was honest, not performative. "I know that you saved one of my men yesterday, and I know that's not something I deserve from you." Clara looked at him steadily. "You're right that you're still figuring it out," she said. That's actually the correct place to be. People who think they've fully understood something like this usually haven't. She paused. Dex is going to be okay. They found an accessory pathway. It's treatable. He'll miss the deployment, but he'll come back. Mercer's jaw moved. I know. Reese told me this morning. Good. The room was quiet. Outside in the corridor, someone was moving quickly, footsteps and the sound of a door. The video, Mercer said. Don't worry about the video. It's out there. It's out there and it says what it says, and in a week it'll be something else, Clara said. The internet has a short attention span. What it doesn't have a short attention span for is pattern. If this is a pattern with you, that's the problem. If it's not, if you actually learn from it, then the video becomes the story of a man who made a mistake and changed. She looked at him. Which version it is entirely up to you. He held her gaze. I understand that, ma'am. Good. She stood. He stood with her. Bring your people home from Carrington, Sergeant. Yes, ma'am. She started toward the door. He stayed where he was for a moment and then said, Secretary Voss. She stopped, turned. He had his cover in both hands. He looked at it for a second, then back at her. I looked up your file. The parts that aren't classified. He paused. I didn't know people did the things you did. She looked at him for a moment. Most people don't know what other people have done, she said. That's the point I was trying to make Thursday night. She held his gaze one more time. Take care of your people. She went out. The day continued with the determined momentum of a workday that had been interrupted too many times and needed to reclaim its ground. Clara finished the logistics review. She reviewed and signed the conduct documentation with Dunbar. She took 3 calls from her chief of staff about matters unrelated to Port Calder. She ate lunch at a conference table while reading a fleet readiness assessment and thought about the numbers, which were better than they'd been 6 months ago, but not as good as they needed to be, and made notes. At 15:45, Stern called with a media request from a National Veterans Affairs publication who wanted a brief statement about the events at the Kestrel and Anchor. Clara told her to pass them to the communications office and let them handle the factual summary. No interview, not this week. At 1600, 3rd Battalion rotated out of Halcyon Bay. She didn't watch them go. She was in the middle of a call. At 17, Briggs found her in the corridor outside the administrative wing, and she suspected he'd been waiting to find her somewhere where the conversation could happen without an audience. He fell into step beside her. For the first 10 seconds, neither of them said anything, which was fine. Briggs was a man who understood the value of silence. You handled it right, he said finally. All of it. I handled it the way I handle things, she said. That's not always right. The boy, Dex. He'll be okay. I know, I went by the clinic. He paused. He's going to have a story to tell for the rest of his life. Several people are going to have a story to tell, she said. They came to the end of the corridor and she stopped and he stopped with her. The window at the end looked out over the parade ground, which was empty now in the late afternoon. You're leaving tomorrow? He said. Morning flight. He nodded. Then, after a moment, I've been in this work for 31 years. I've met a lot of people who had power, not many who knew what to do with it when it cost them something. Clara looked at the parade ground. It didn't cost me much. It cost you the thing you came here to have, he said. A quiet Thursday. He looked at her profile. That's not nothing. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. It's not nothing. They stood at the window for a moment longer, and then she said she needed to finish her evening briefing materials, and he said he'd see her when he saw her, and they went their separate ways in the manner of people who understood that some things didn't need to be prolonged to be real. That night, in her hotel room, she got the call she'd been waiting for without knowing she'd been waiting for it. It was Eddie Carmichael. He'd gotten her number through the hospital, Dr. Taft, she suspected, and he called at 2100 from his room in the cardiac ICU, where he was apparently still awake and apparently still persuasive enough to get his phone back from the nurses after visiting hours. His voice was rougher than it would normally be and slower, with the particular quality of someone who'd been through something significant and was still on the near side of it. But it was clear. I understand you were the person, he said, at the bar. Yes. I don't remember much. He paused. I remember a voice telling me to stay. I'm glad you did, she said. My daughter said She said the cardiologist told her that the field assessment was what made the difference, that if they'd gotten the wrong information from the scene, the surgical approach would have been different. A long pause. She said they caught something in the arrhythmia pattern that they might have missed. The pattern was unusual, Clara said. You made it easy, actually. The indicators were clear if you knew what to look for. You knew what to look for? Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I was a Navy commander, he said. 24 years. Retired 8 years ago. Every Thursday I go to the Kestrel and Anchor. I've been doing it since I retired. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite emotion but was its near neighbor. I've sat in that bar for 8 years and I never thought... He stopped. I guess you never think it's going to be the night. No, she said. You don't. Well, he cleared his throat. I wanted to say thank you. I understand that's inadequate, but it's what I've got. It's enough, she said. She meant it. It was enough. It was in fact exactly what she needed at 2100 on a Friday night in a hotel room in Port Calder, after 2 days that had taken more out of her than she was going to fully know until she slept and woke up and took stock. She talked to Eddie Carmichael for another 12 minutes, mostly about his recovery timeline and what to expect in the weeks ahead, practical and specific in the way she defaulted to when there was something useful she could give someone. When they hung up, she sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Her sister had texted again. Still waiting for the call. The dog misses you. I might also miss you. She smiled, actually smiled, which was a thing that hadn't happened much in the past 48 hours. She texted back, I'll call Sunday. Save me some of whatever you're cooking. She put the phone down and opened her laptop. She had 3 documents that needed review before her morning flight, and she was going to do them tonight so she could sleep without that list hanging. She opened the first document. Her email notification showed a new message. She almost ignored it. The inbox was always full of things that could wait. But the sender caught her eye. The sender was Colonel Raymond Reese. The subject line was, For your awareness, submitted 2058 tonight. She opened it. It was a forwarded document. Reese's email said only, He did this on his own. I didn't ask him to. Thought you should know. The forwarded document was a formal request submitted through 3rd Battalion's admin system at 2058 that evening, 40 minutes after Mercer's unit had landed at Carrington Naval Air Facility. It was a request for voluntary enrollment in the base's Emergency Medical Response Advanced Training Program. The notes field, which was optional and rarely used, said, Request assigned to first available cohort. Purpose, personal and unit readiness improvement. Reason for voluntary enrollment, because I should have known more and I didn't. Clara read it twice. She sat in the hotel room with the laptop open in the quiet of the late evening around her, and she looked at that last line, because I should have known more and I didn't. And she thought about what it took for a man like Mercer to write that. Not the typing of it, the arriving at it. She closed the email. She opened the first review document and started reading. She was 40 minutes into the second document, past midnight now, when her phone rang again. Not a number she recognized. She almost let it go. Then something, the same instinct that had read rooms correctly for 30 years, made her pick up. The voice on the other end was female, professional, and tightly controlled in the manner of someone delivering information they were not sure of the reception to. Secretary Voss, this is Commander Dana Rell, JAG Corps. I apologize for the hour. A pause. I need to inform you that an inquiry has been opened by a third party this evening regarding the events at the Kestrel and Anchor and their aftermath. Specifically, the inquiry alleges that the conduct review outcome reached today was improperly influenced by your personal intervention in the documentation process. Clara put down her pen. Who opened it? She said. The inquiry was filed by Major Patrick Donnell, 3rd Battalion's legal officer. Another pause. He's alleging that the resolution was structured to protect a personal interest and that the documentation as filed does not accurately reflect the severity of the original conduct. Clara was quiet. He's further alleging, Rell continued, that your presence in the Kestrel and Anchor on Thursday evening was not, as stated, personal and recreational, but was part of an undisclosed operational observation of the base command structure. The voice tightened fractionally. The inquiry has been accepted for preliminary review by the Naval Inspector General's office. They've requested that you make yourself available for an interview before you depart Port Calder. Clara looked at the window, at the dark waterfront. at the city that had been quiet for 2 days without managing to stay that way. When? She said. Tomorrow morning, Rel said. 0700. She set the phone down on the desk and sat with the information for exactly 60 seconds. Not because she needed the time to process it. The information was clear, and the implications were clear, and the 60 seconds weren't about understanding. They were about deciding what kind of tired she was going to let herself be before she started working the problem. Major Patrick Donnell. She'd pulled up the 3rd Battalion legal officer roster when Dunbar had been reviewing documentation that afternoon, the kind of reflexive orientation she did in any new institutional environment, and she'd noted Donnell then, 15 years in JAG, aggressive filing history, 2 prior complaints against superior officers that had both been dismissed but had left marks. The kind of officer who believed in the adversarial process with a fervor that occasionally outran his judgment about when the adversarial process was the right tool. She picked up her phone and called Price. He answered on the 3rd ring, which meant he'd been asleep, which meant she was waking the Chief of Naval Operations at midnight and was going to have to be concise about why. Donnell filed an IG inquiry, she said. 3rd Battalion JAG, alleging the conduct resolution was improperly managed and that my presence at the Kestrel and Anchor was operational, not personal. A silence. You're serious. IG wants me at 0700 before my flight. Another silence, longer, with a different quality. Clara, this is... I know what it is, she said. I'm not calling for reassurance. I'm calling because you need to know tonight, not tomorrow, and because Dunbar needs to be looped in before 0700. I'll call Dunbar. His voice was fully awake now. What do you need from me in that room? Nothing, she said. I can handle the interview. I'm calling because there's a documentation question. The conduct review record needs to be independently verifiable as procedurally clean, and I want Dunbar to pull the paper trail tonight and confirm there's nothing Donnell can point to as irregular. It's clean, Price said. I know it's clean. I want it confirmed on paper before I walk into that room. She paused. And I want someone to look at Donnell's timeline. He filed at 2058. That's 2 hours after the unit landed at Carrington. He didn't have access to the full documentation in that window, which means he filed on partial information. Price was quiet. Which means, she continued, that this isn't about the documentation. It's about something else. I want to know what that something else is before 0700. She heard him exhale. All right, he said. I'll make the calls. Thank you. She hung up, put the phone down, looked at her laptop and the review documents she'd been working through, which were no longer the most pressing thing on her list, opened a new document, began writing her own timeline of the past 48 hours, not for the IG interview specifically, but because writing things down was how she organized them, and she needed them organized before she slept. She wrote for 40 minutes. The account was precise and unembellished and included the things that didn't make her look entirely in control. The misread of Mercer's likely behavior, the decision to go to the Kestrel and Anchor without notification to the base, the moment in the hallway when she'd allowed herself 30 seconds of relief before going back to work. She didn't clean any of it up. An account you cleaned up was an account with seams, and seams were where inquiries found purchase. She finished, saved it, closed the laptop. She slept 4 hours. It was enough. She'd operated on less. The Naval Inspector General's office maintained a liaison presence at Halcyon Bay, a small suite of rooms in the administrative wing that were used for exactly this kind of preliminary interview when something needed to be assessed before it became a formal investigation. The IG officer assigned to the preliminary review was a commander named Voss, which created a moment of administrative confusion when Clara arrived at 0655 that she noted and set aside. The IG commander's name was Gerald Voss, no relation, a man in his 50s with the careful manner of someone who had spent a career being fair-minded about things that other people found straightforward. He offered her coffee. She took it. Dunbar was already in the room, which meant Price had reached her before midnight and she'd come in early, which meant Clara owed Dunbar something when this was over. They sat. Commander Voss explained the inquiry in the procedural language the role required. Clara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "What would be most useful? Should I walk you through the 48 hours sequentially, or do you have specific areas you want to address first?" "Sequential is fine," he said. She walked him through it, all of it, from the moment she'd arrived in Port Calder to the phone call from Commander Rell the previous night. She used the account she'd written at midnight as the organizational spine, but she didn't read from it. She knew it, and speaking from memory rather than notes carried a different quality of credibility that she was aware of and not above using. She answered follow-up questions with the same directness she brought to everything. When Voss asked about the decision to limit the conduct review outcome, she explained her reasoning without defensiveness. When he asked whether she'd disclosed her identity at any point during the Thursday evening, she said no and explained why she hadn't, and explained further that she had the right not to. It took 50 minutes. When she finished, Voss made a note on his legal pad. Then he said, Major Donnell's filing alleges that the conduct review documentation, specifically the limitation to a conduct review and ethics refresher, reflects a personal interest in protecting Sergeant Mercer from the full consequences of his actions, rather than an objective determination of appropriate response. The determination was objective, Clara said. The outcome was proportionate to the conduct, given the withdrawal of the complaint, the absence of prior disciplinary history, and the quality of the sergeant's service record. Major Dunbar reviewed and signed off on the documentation. She paused. If Major Donnell's position is that a more severe outcome was warranted, he's entitled to that legal opinion. But opinion isn't evidence of improper influence. Voss wrote something. He further alleges that your presence at the Kestrel and Anchor was connected to a pre-planned review of base command performance, and that the confrontation with Sergeant Mercer was used as an opportunity to gather evidence for that review. Clara looked at him. I was having a club soda, she said. I've been having club soda at bars near naval installations for 31 years. If Major Donnell has documentation supporting the claim that my recreational choices are covert operational tools, I'd be interested to see it. Dunbar made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She covered it with a cough. Commander Voss looked at his legal pad. Then he looked up. Secretary Voss, no relation, I want to be direct with you about where this inquiry stands. He set his pen down. The filing lacks evidentiary support for both primary allegations. The documentation from the conduct review is procedurally clean. There's no record or witness account supporting the claim that your presence at the bar was operational. He paused. I'm going to recommend the inquiry be closed without proceeding to formal investigation. All right, she said. That recommendation will go to the IG this morning. Barring something unexpected, you'll have confirmation before you depart. She nodded. Thank you for the early session. Of course. He picked up his pen again. One more thing. Off the record, if that's acceptable to you. She looked at him. The cardiac response, he said. At the bar, and then in the training yard. I have a daughter who's a paramedic. She's been sharing the story with her colleagues since the hospital statement went out. He paused. I just wanted to say, as a person, not an officer, that what you did mattered, to people who have never heard your name and never will. Clara was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said. That one goes in the file I don't write down. She was back in her hotel room at 0820, packing, which didn't take long because she'd learned over 30 years to travel light, when Price called. Donnell, he said, I found something else. She put a folded shirt in the bag. Tell me. He filed a conduct complaint 18 months ago against a female JAG officer in his unit. Alleged professional misconduct. The complaint was reviewed, found without merit, and dismissed. The reviewing officer was Lieutenant Commander Paula Stern. Clara stopped packing. He's been carrying a grievance against Stern for 18 months, Price said. When Stern appeared at Halcyon Bay as your liaison, and then the conduct review resolution came out the way it did, he filed against you, but Stern was the target architecture. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She thought about this. Does Stern know? Not yet. I wanted to tell you first. Tell her today, Clara said. She needs the full picture. She paused. And Donnell? The IG is recommending his filing be closed without investigation. Given that the filing appears to have been motivated by a pre-existing grievance against a member of your staff, rather than genuine procedural concern, there's a question of whether the filing itself constitutes misuse of the IG process. Don't pursue it, she said. A pause. Clara, if we pursue it, it becomes a story about retaliation, about the Secretary of the Navy going after a JAG officer who filed an inquiry against her. She picked up the shirt she'd set down and folded it again, more carefully. Close the inquiry. Let the record show it was without merit. Let Donald carry that on his filing history. That's enough. It's more than enough, Price said, with a quality in his voice that meant he was thinking about what the right thing was versus what the satisfying thing was, and coming to terms with the distance between them. The inquiry outcome, she said. When it's confirmed, send a copy to Reese. Why Reese? Because he's Mercer's commanding officer, and I want Mercer to know that someone filed against me and it went nowhere, and I want him to know I didn't push it further, not because I owe him that information, but because it's the kind of thing that finishes a lesson. Price was quiet for a moment. You're a complicated person, Clara. I've been told, she said. She finished packing. The inquiry was formally closed at 10:15. The confirmation came to her phone while she was in the cab to the airport. A brief official notification from the IG office that said exactly what Commander Voss had said it would say. Insufficient evidentiary basis for proceeding to formal investigation. Inquiry closed. Record sealed at preliminary review stage. She read it. Forwarded it to Dunbar with a note of thanks. Put the phone in her pocket. The cab drove through Port Calder, which was doing its Friday morning thing. Traffic moving in the unhurried way of a mid-sized coastal city that had its own rhythms and didn't much care about the events on the naval base 3 miles away. She looked out the window at the waterfront, at the gray-green water under a sky that had finally decided on overcast rather than the indecision of the night before. She thought about Thursday night, about the Kestrel and Anchor, the yellow streetlights, the way the room had felt when she'd walked in, full of people who'd served, who'd built their lives around service, who gathered in that particular space because it was theirs in a way that wasn't complicated by the outside world. She'd wanted an hour of that, just an hour inside something real. She'd gotten considerably more than an hour, and considerably more complicated, and she wasn't sure whether the complication was the cost of the evening or the point of it. Maybe both. The cab pulled up to the terminal. She got out, paid, took her bag. Stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside the entrance. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. It was a text from an unknown number that turned out, when she read it, to be from Pete the bartender. She didn't know how he'd gotten her number and didn't particularly want to know. Bases were porous, people knew people. But the text was short and direct in the way of a man who'd spent years working in a room where people said what they meant or didn't say it at all. Eddie is asking about you from the ICU. Thought you should know. He says Thursday night was the best night of his life, which all things considered seems optimistic, but also maybe true. Pete. She read it twice. Then she typed back. Tell him I said that's a low bar, and he should aim higher in the future. See. She pocketed the phone and went inside. The flight was 2 hours. She worked for the first hour. The review documents she hadn't finished the night before. The fleet readiness numbers. A draft memo on the maintenance pipeline that she wanted to revise before it went out. Efficient, focused, the work settling her the way it always had, giving her hands and mind something to do while the larger things processed underneath. In the second hour, she closed the laptop. She looked at the clouds below the window and thought about what the past 72 hours had contained and what she thought about it, and whether thinking about it produced anything useful. What she kept coming back to was not the inquiry, not Donnell, not even Mercer in the training yard. What she kept coming back to was Eddie Carmichael's voice on the phone at 2100. I remember a voice telling me to stay. And the fact that she hadn't known him, hadn't known his name or his history or his 24 years of service, and had spoken to him anyway, because that was what you did. You spoke to people because they were there, because they were in front of you, not because of their rank or their record or the category you put them in when they walked through a door, because they were a person in a room and you were also a person in a room, and sometimes that was the whole of it. She had spent Thursday night being treated as something without context, without history, without value beyond what was visible on the surface. And the things she kept knowing, the things she'd known the whole time without particularly needing to announce it, was that the invisibility was fine. The invisibility was just what happened when you walked into a room without your title. It was the response to the invisibility that told you something. Mercer's response had told her something, not a good something, but he'd been listening since she believed that, in the particular way she'd learned to assess whether people were listening or just managing, and listening was where change started, if it started anywhere. Donnell's response had told her something too. about grievance carried wrong, about how the tools meant for justice could be bent towards smaller purposes, about the difference between process and principle. He'd filed an inquiry that had no basis because he was angry about a different injury, and the record would reflect that now, and she hoped he'd sit with it. She wasn't holding her breath. And somewhere in between those two things, the sergeant who'd been wrong and was learning from it, and the major who'd tried to use the system against her and found out what the system looked like when it worked correctly, was the part of the story that didn't get told neatly. The part where she was tired and human and had wanted one quiet Thursday and hadn't gotten it and had gone on anyway, because that was what you did with the Thursday you actually had. The plane began its descent. She looked at the window, at the landscape coming up through the clouds, and she thought, 31 years. And the work is still there. And that's not a burden, most of the time. Most of the time, it's the thing that gets you out of bed. The thing nobody told you about power. Real power. Not the kind that came from a title, but the kind that came from knowing what you were doing and why. Was that it wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It didn't need to put its hand on anyone's arm. It just kept working, kept reading rooms, kept finding the pulse point in the dark, and pressing exactly there until something stabilized. It was quiet. It was trained. And it was patient in the particular way that 31 years of being underestimated and overworked and sent into impossible environments with inadequate resources made you patient. Not with the patience of someone who'd given up, but with the patience of someone who understood that the work was longer than any individual moment, and that the moment in front of you was always the one that mattered. The wheels touched down. Her phone came off airplane mode and loaded 3 messages. One from Stern, brief, professional, and underneath the professionalism, shaken, which was the appropriate response to learning that you'd been the actual target of an IG inquiry without knowing it. Clara made a note to have a real conversation with her, not an email, something that acknowledged that what had happened to Stern was its own thing. One from her chief of staff with the week's schedule, which was full in the way the schedule was always full. And one from Reese. His message was 3 sentences. Mercer's enrollment in the EMRT program went through this morning. First available cohort is 6 weeks out. He requested the evening slot so it doesn't conflict with his deployment preparation when he returns. She read it once. Then she put the phone in her bag, gathered her things, and stood up when the seatbelt sign went off. She walked off the plane the way she walked most places. Steady, not particularly fast, not performing anything for anyone. Just a woman with a bag and somewhere to be, moving through an airport like a person. Nobody looked twice. That was fine, she had work to do. And a man in a cardiac ICU who was apparently having the best week of his life, and a 22-year-old Marine who was going to need someone to explain to him what an accessory pathway was and what it meant for his career. And a sergeant in Carrington who was signing up for evening classes because he'd looked at his own hands and decided they should know how to do more than they knew how to do. None of that was because they'd found out who she was. That was the part she needed people to understand, though she knew she'd never say it directly, because the things that were most important were usually the ones that fell apart when you tried to explain them. It wasn't because of her title, it wasn't because of her file, or her appointment, or the authority that attached to her name in official documents. It was because a woman had been sitting in a bar, and she'd kept her hands ready, and when someone needed them, she'd used them. That was all. That was, in the end, everything. She walked out of the terminal into the afternoon, and the light was doing something interesting with the clouds, that particular late October quality where the sun was lower than you expected and caught everything sideways, and she stood on the sidewalk for a second and just let it land on her face before the car came.